He was a king feared by all, cruel, proud, and merciless. But when he crossed paths with a poor widow whose faith never broke, his throne began to crumble and his heart began to change. The drums of the kingdom beat slowly that morning, not in celebration, but in sorrow. A pale mist covered the small village of Lumbani, and the air carried whispers of fear. The people walked with bowed heads, avoiding the palace guards who rode through the dusty road like lions among sheep. At the far end of the village lived Mary, a widow known for her kindness. Her hut was small, built with mud and love, and though her husband's death had left her empty, she still found strength to smile for the sake of her only son, Samuel. But that morning, even her heart trembled. A loud voice echoed through the streets. By order of King Edward, all villagers must bring their harvest to the palace before sunset. Mary dropped her basket. She had barely enough grain to feed her child, and now the king wanted to take it all. Her neighbors whispered in fear, "Do not question the king, or you'll disappear like the others." Still, Mary could not stay silent. She looked at her son, his eyes wide, innocent, hungry. Her heart burned with courage. "I will go to the palace," she said softly. "Even a widow has a voice before God." That afternoon, she wrapped her worn shawl and walked to the palace gates. Her bare feet dusted with red earth. The guards laughed. "Who are you to ask for an audience with the king?" "A mother," she replied, "and that should be enough." The king sat upon a golden throne when she was brought in, tall, cold, his eyes hard as stone. The hall was silent except for the echo of her steps. "Your Majesty," Mary began, her voice trembling, "I have only a little grain left for my son. If I give it all, he will starve. Please, have mercy." King Edward leaned forward. "Mercy?" he repeated mockingly. "Does the lion beg the antelope before eating it?" Laughter filled the court. But Mary did not bow. "Even lions die when they forget who gives them breath," she said quietly. The hall fell silent. The king's eyes darkened. "You dare speak to me like that?" he thundered. "Guards, seize her grain and let her taste the price of defiance." As the soldiers dragged her away, she cried, "God of justice, hear me! A king who oppresses widows will not reign forever." The king laughed. "Let's see if your God can save you." That night, thunder rolled across the kingdom. The palace torches flickered, and somewhere in the darkness, an old blind elder whispered, "A curse has been spoken, and heaven has heard." Meanwhile, Mary knelt outside her hut in the rain, clutching her son. "Don't cry, Samuel," she said, her voice breaking. "Tears water the seeds of tomorrow. One day, justice will grow," and as lightning flashed across the sky, the drums of Lumbani fell silent, as though even the wind was listening to her prayer. The night after the widow's curse, the palace was restless. Thunder rumbled like angry drums, and lightning tore through the sky as if the heavens were speaking. King Edward tossed on his golden bed, unable to sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw her face. The widow's eyes, filled with both pain and courage. "A widow's cry cannot shake a king," he told himself. But deep in his heart, something began to tremble. At last, when sleep came, it brought no peace, only terror. He dreamed he stood in a great field of gold, surrounded by his riches. Suddenly, the ground cracked open beneath him. His crown melted in his hands. The palace walls crumbled, and from the dust, a voice rose, gentle yet powerful. "You took bread from the hungry and mocked the tears of the weak. Now your throne will remember their cries. He tried to run, but the earth swallowed his feet. Then he saw a small child and Samuel standing beside the widow. The boy's eyes glowed with light, and he stretched out his hand. "Your pride will be your fall, O king," the boy said. Then thunder struck, and the king awoke screaming. His guards rushed in. "Your Majesty, are you hurt?" "No," he snapped, wiping sweat from his face. "It was only a dream." But his voice shook. That morning, he summoned Elder Thomas, the oldest man in the kingdom, known for his wisdom. "Old man," said the king, "I had a dream. Tell me what it means." Elder Thomas bowed slowly. "Dreams are the whispers of the spirit world, Your Majesty. Tell me what you saw." When the king described it, the elder's face grew pale. "The widow you mocked has been heard in heaven," he said softly. "Her tears have reached the throne of God. If you do not change your ways, your kingdom will crumble like dust." The king slammed his staff. "You dare speak curses in my court? I am the voice of the gods here." The elder met his gaze. "No man is the voice of God, Your Majesty. Even kings must bow before justice." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, with a wave of his hand, the king ordered, "Take this old fool away before his tongue brings misfortune." But as Elder Thomas was dragged out, he turned and said, "A river that forgets its source will one day run dry." The words struck the king's heart like a blade. He stood alone in his golden hall, surrounded by treasures, yet somehow he felt poorer than the widow he had mocked. That night, the dream returned. Only this time, the golden field was gone. He was standing before a massive storm, and in it, he saw his daughter, Princess Grace, crying as the palace burned behind her. "Father," she screamed, "your cruelty has opened the gates of ruin." He awoke again, gasping, sweat dripping down his face. For the first time, King Edward felt something he had never known before: fear. The palace had grown quieter since the king's nightmares began. Servants whispered in corners, guards avoided his eyes, and even the wind seemed afraid to pass through his windows. But among those who noticed the change most was his daughter, Princess Grace. She was nothing like her father, gentle, kind, with eyes that carried peace even in storm. While the king ruled with fear, Grace believed in compassion. She often walked among the villagers in disguise, giving food to the hungry and tending to the sick. That morning, as she prepared to visit the village again, her maid whispered, "Your Highness, the king forbade anyone from leaving the palace. He fears another curse." Grace smiled softly. "If my father fears curses, he should start by fearing his own deeds." She wrapped herself in a plain shawl and left through the servants' gate. Down in the village, people were still recovering from hunger. The widow Mary's hut stood silent, its door half broken from when the guards took her grain. Grace knelt beside the small boy playing outside. "What is your name?" she asked gently. "Samuel," he said shyly. His eyes were bright despite the emptiness around him. Grace smiled and gave him a loaf of bread. "For you and your mother." When Mary came out, weak but dignified, she froze at the sight of the strange woman. "You shouldn't be here," Mary said softly. "The king's guards will punish anyone who helps us." Grace looked into her eyes. Sometimes, mercy is the only law that matters. As the two women spoke, a sudden wind blew through the village. The trees swayed as though listening. Then, from behind the huts, an old man appeared, Elder Thomas, bruised but alive. Princess Grace, he said with a bow, you carry a light this kingdom has forgotten. Grace gasped. You know who I am? The spirits do not hide truth from the wise, he said. He looked at Mary and then back at the princess. The king's days of power are numbered. The tears of the widow have reached the heavens, and soon the son of a widow will stand before a fallen crown. Mary's heart pounded. What do you mean? The child you raise will grow into the voice of justice. Protect him, for he carries the future of this land. Grace looked at Samuel. The boy smiled, innocent, unaware of destiny's weight. The sky suddenly darkened. Thunder rumbled far away, a reminder that even the clouds were watching. Grace whispered, if the king, my father, must fall for peace to rise, then so be it. Elder Thomas nodded solemnly. The river will cleanse itself when the storm comes. That night, when Grace returned to the palace, she found her father staring at his reflection in a bowl of wine. Where have you been? He demanded. Among your people, she replied calmly. They are not my people. They are subjects, he roared. Then perhaps that is why they no longer pray for you, she said quietly. The king's hand froze. For a moment, he saw the same fire in her eyes that he saw in his dreams. As Grace turned to leave, she whispered, Father, even gold rusts when it forgets its worth. The king said nothing, but that night the thunder returned, louder than before, and in her small hut, far away, Mary held her son close as the rain began to fall again. Sleep, my child, she murmured. The storm that frightens kings will one day protect us. The rain did not stop for 7 days. It poured over the kingdom of Lumbani as if the heavens themselves mourned. The rivers swelled, farmlands drowned, and even the royal gardens turned to mud. The people whispered, the widow's tears have reached the sky. Inside the palace, King Edward's pride began to rot like wood left in water. He could not sleep, he could not eat. The same dream returned. The earth swallowing his throne, the widow's voice echoing through the storm. One morning he stood before his mirror and gasped. A patch of his hair had turned white overnight. Fetch the royal healer, he shouted. The healer examined him, trembling. Your Majesty, this is not sickness. It is a sign. A sign of what? The king barked. Of judgment, whispered the healer, bowing his head. The king struck him across the face. Lies. There is no judgment for kings, but deep in his heart, he knew the curse had begun. In the village, the people suffered under the flood. Huts were washed away, and hunger returned. Yet somehow, the widow Mary's hut still stood, untouched by the rising waters. Neighbors came to her for shelter. She welcomed them all, her son Samuel helping to share what little they had. Why is your home still standing? One woman asked in awe. Mary smiled softly, because mercy builds stronger walls than pride. That night, as thunder cracked across the sky, Elder Thomas appeared again at her door. The river has begun to speak, he said. The curse moves from palace to field, from pride to pain. But fear not, for what is born in storm will rise in sunlight. Samuel looked up at the old man. Will the king hurt us again? No, child, the elder said, touching his head gently. He is already hurting himself. Meanwhile, back in the palace, strange things began to happen. The king's golden crown grew too heavy to wear. Each time he placed it on his head, his vision blurred. At night, he heard whispers echoing through the halls, voices of the poor crying for justice. The palace walls creaked as though alive. The torches dimmed whenever he entered a room. One night, he called for his daughter. Grace, he said, his voice trembling. "Tell me, do you think I am cursed?" Grace looked at him with sorrow. "Father, you cursed yourself the day you forgot the pain of others." He turned away, tears burning in his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. "A king does not weep," Grace whispered. "Then perhaps that is why you cannot heal." Her words pierced him deeper than any sword. Days later, the palace messenger returned from the market in fear. "Your Majesty," he cried, "the people are saying the river goddess has turned against the crown." The king rose angrily. "Fools! How can a river fight a king?" But before he finished, thunder roared so loudly that the golden chandelier above them cracked and fell to the floor, missing him by an inch. Everyone in the hall fell silent. For the first time, King Edward's knees shook. "Perhaps," he whispered, "even the gods have grown tired of me." That night, the king stood on his palace balcony, watching lightning tear the sky apart. Below him, the village shimmered faintly under the rain, and among the huts, one small fire glowed bright. He recognized it, the widow's home. He clenched his fists. "Why does her light burn when mine fades?" The wind answered with silence, and as he turned away, a whisper echoed through the storm, soft but clear. "Because her heart is pure, and yours is not." The king fell to his knees, shaking. For the first time since he wore the crown, he felt fear and shame. The storms finally ceased, but the silence that followed was worse. The kingdom of Lumbani lay in ruins, broken fences, ruined crops, and hunger in every home. The people no longer sang the morning songs. They whispered instead. "The gods are angry with the king." The widow's tears cursed the land. And while fear ruled the villages, hope began to stir quietly within the palace walls, in the heart of Princess Grace. Grace had always loved the people. As a child, she would sneak out to play among the village children. But after her mother's death, her father forbade her to leave the palace. "A princess belongs to the throne," he said, "not the dust." But Grace never forgot the faces of the poor, especially one kind woman who had once fed her roasted yam when she was lost in the marketplace years ago. That woman was Mary, the widow. So one moonlit night, when the palace guards slept and her father snored in his golden chamber, Grace wrapped herself in a plain brown shawl and slipped out through the back gate. The path to the village was muddy and quiet. Frogs croaked by the flooded fields. She walked quickly, hiding her face, her heart pounding in her chest. When she reached the widow's hut, she froze. Warm orange light flickered through the cracks. Inside, laughter echoed, gentle and pure. She peeked through the small window and saw Mary and Samuel kneeling in prayer, surrounded by neighbors. Their home, though poor, glowed with peace. Tears filled Grace's eyes. "They have nothing," she whispered, "and yet they have everything." She knocked softly. Mary turned, startled. When she saw the stranger, she asked kindly, "Child, what do you seek at this hour?" Grace bowed her head. "I seek forgiveness for my father's sins." Mary looked at her carefully. "Who are you, child?" "Grace," she said quietly, "the king's daughter." The hut fell silent. Everyone gasped, but Mary did not kneel, nor tremble. She simply stepped forward and took Grace's hands. "Then you are most welcome," she said softly, "for mercy begins where pride ends." Grace stayed that night. She helped serve food to hungry children and washed the feet of tired villagers. For the first time in her life, She felt useful, not royal. Samuel smiled at her. "You don't look like a princess," he teased. Grace laughed. "Maybe that's the best thing I've heard all year." Outside, the moon glowed bright over the still waters. It was the first peaceful night the kingdom had seen in months. Meanwhile, back at the palace, King Edward woke with a start. Grace's bed was empty. Her royal robe lay folded neatly on the chair. "Find my daughter," he roared. The guards scattered, terrified. When they found her footprints leading toward the village, the king's face darkened. "She dares walk among the peasants?" he thundered. "She will learn what disobedience costs." But even as he shouted, his chest ached. A deep pain struck his heart, not of anger, but of guilt. He remembered his wife's dying words. "If you lose mercy, you will lose everything." And for the first time, he wondered if it was already too late. At dawn, Grace returned to the palace quietly, her feet dusty, her hands bruised, but her heart lighter than ever. She entered her father's chamber. He stood by the window, his eyes red from sleeplessness. "Where have you been?" he growled. "With the people," she replied, "where a ruler should begin." He turned sharply. "You have disobeyed your king." Grace stepped closer. "No, father. I obeyed my heart." Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. "You taught me that power is everything, but I saw something greater, compassion. It feeds hearts that gold cannot." The king raised his hand as if to strike her, but stopped. Her tears fell silently. He dropped his arm and turned away, his voice low. "Leave me. I cannot bear your mother's eyes in your face." Grace bowed. "Then perhaps one day you will learn to bear your own reflection." She left him alone with his silence, and though he didn't admit it, her words burned deeper than any wound. That night, as the moon climbed over the palace, the king walked to his balcony again. Below him, he saw the widow's hut, glowing faintly like a star in the dark valley. And this time, instead of anger, he felt something new, envy mixed with longing. "What kind of strength lives in that woman?" he murmured. The wind carried no answer, only the distant sound of village children laughing in the night. The palace had grown silent. No music, no laughter, no peace. Even the air felt heavy, as though every wall in the great kingdom of Lambani carried the echo of guilt. The people no longer came to the palace gates to sing or bow. They came to plead. "Our crops are dead, my king. Our children are hungry. Have mercy." But King Edward sat on his golden throne, motionless. His eyes were sunken, his crown tilted loosely. He waved his hand weakly. "Disperse them." Each voice faded, one after the other, like candles in the wind. In his chamber, the king stared at his reflection again. The white streak in his hair had spread. His skin was pale, his hands trembled. The royal physician could not explain it. "You are haunted," whispered the old man, "not by ghosts, but by the weight of your choices." The king dismissed him angrily, but as the door closed, he whispered to himself, "He is right." That night, he dreamed again. He saw himself walking through a dry field. The soil cracked under his feet. He bent down to touch it, and the earth turned to ashes. Then, from the smoke, a widow's voice rose softly. "You cannot rule a land you have cursed with your own hands." He woke with a start, sweat covering his face. The room felt smaller, darker. Even his crown on the table looked heavy and lifeless. The next morning, Grace entered quietly, carrying a bowl of herbs. "Father," she said gently, "you must eat." "Leave me," he murmured. "Your pity burns my pride." Grace knelt beside him. Then let your pride starve instead. Eat what your body needs, not what your anger wants. Her words struck him, but her tenderness disarmed him more than any blade could. For a long moment, they said nothing. Only the sound of rain dripping outside broke the silence. Finally, the king whispered, "Do the people still hate me?" Grace looked down. "They do not hate you, father. They fear what you have become." The king turned away. His voice cracked. "And what have I become, Grace?" She stood, eyes glistening. A man who forgot how to listen to his own heart. Later that day, Grace found him wandering the palace garden, barefoot, his robe trailing behind him. He stopped beside the fountain, now dry and cracked. "Even the water refuses me," he said. Grace reached out to touch his arm, but he pulled away. "Do not comfort me, child. I have done too much to deserve soft hands." She looked at him with quiet pain. "Then do something worthy of forgiveness." He frowned. "Forgiveness? From whom? The gods? The widow? My people?" "From yourself," she said simply. "That is where healing begins." Her words lingered in the air like incense. He didn't reply, but something inside him shifted. Small, fragile, but real. That night, King Edward sat alone by candlelight. He opened an old wooden box beside his bed. Inside was a torn piece of cloth, the shawl his late wife used to wear. He held it tightly. "My queen," he murmured, "you told me mercy makes a man stronger. But I feared it made me weak." He looked toward the window where lightning flickered. Was I wrong all along? The wind blew softly through the open window. The candle flame flickered but didn't die. For the first time in months, the king felt a strange calm, like the beginning of an answer. In the village, the widow Mary looked toward the palace hill. "The storm in the sky is passing," she said quietly. Elder Thomas nodded beside her. "Yes, but the one in the king's heart has only begun." Mary sighed deeply. "Then may his burden lead him to light, before it buries him in darkness." That night, as thunder rumbled far away, the king stood again at his balcony. He looked down at the faint lights in the valley, the village he once ignored. He whispered softly, "Perhaps tomorrow I will go there myself." And for the first time, he didn't sound like a king. He sounded like a man. The sun rose quietly that morning, painting the sky with gold and sorrow. King Edward stood by his window, looking at the kingdom he once ruled with iron hands. The streets were empty, the markets quiet. His people had lost faith in him, and deep inside, he knew he had earned their silence. He turned to Princess Grace, who stood beside him, calm but firm. "Father," she said softly, "you can still make things right." The king's voice broke. "How can a man who broke hearts heal them again?" "By walking the road of humility," she answered. "Go to her, the widow whose tears shook your throne." The king's pride hesitated, but his heart could not. For nights, her curse had echoed in his dreams. He remembered her face, not filled with hate, but with truth. So, without his crown or royal robes, he wrapped himself in a simple brown cloak and left the palace with Elder Thomas guiding him. The guards tried to follow, but he waved them away. "No swords today," he said, "only repentance." They walked through the dusty roads of the kingdom. The people gasped as they saw him. Some bowed in fear. Others turned away in anger. Children whispered, "The king walks like a beggar." The journey was long. The sun burned. His sandals tore. And for the first time in his life, the king tasted what it meant to be weak. At the village well, he saw a group of women drawing water. When they recognized him, they stepped back, unsure. The king knelt beside them. "May I have some water?" he asked. One woman, trembling, handed him a calabash. He drank slowly, then bowed his head. "Thank you," he whispered, and tears fell from his eyes. Elder Thomas smiled faintly. The proud tree has learned to bend. Finally, as the sun began to set, they reached the widow's hut, small, quiet, surrounded by dry earth and faded memories. She was sitting outside, pounding herbs beside her young son Samuel. When she looked up and saw the king standing before her, her eyes widened. The pestle fell from her hand. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "why have you come here?" The king dropped to his knees in the dust. The ground that once bowed before him now received his sorrow. "I came to ask for forgiveness," he said, voice trembling. "I mocked your pain. I turned your tears into shame. But your curse has followed me. My palace is silent, my crown is heavy, and my soul is empty." Tears rolled down his face as he bowed low. "Please, forgive me." The widow stood in silence. Samuel, the boy, touched her arm gently. "Mama," he said softly, "maybe the king's heart has changed." She took a deep breath, then stepped forward. Her hands trembled as she placed them on his shoulders. "I am not greater than God," she said. "If heaven can forgive, so can I." The king lifted his head slowly, eyes wet with gratitude. "You have given me more mercy than I ever gave anyone," he whispered. Samuel smiled shyly and handed him a piece of roasted yam. "Eat, Your Majesty. You have walked far." And there, under the fading light, the once wicked king sat with the widow and her son, sharing a humble meal in silence. In that silence, the heavens smiled. For the first time in many years, the king felt peace. The next morning, the cock crowed softly over the widow's hut. King Edward opened his eyes to the smell of roasted maize and the laughter of Samuel outside. He had slept on the cold mud floor, yet somehow it felt softer than his royal bed. The widow was already awake, sweeping the small compound. When she saw him rise, she smiled faintly. Even kings must learn to greet the morning like common men. He bowed his head humbly, "And common men have shown me more kindness than I ever gave." She handed him a calabash of warm porridge. "Eat, Your Majesty." Strength follows humility. As he ate, tears filled his eyes. The taste was simple, but his heart felt full. He looked at Samuel, the boy who once cursed him in his dream, now smiling and playing with a wooden toy. When it was time to leave, the widow stood beside him. "Go back to your people," she said, "but let this dust remind you, a throne means nothing without mercy." The king knelt again, pressed his palm into the earth, and touched it to his heart. "I will never forget." The walk back to the palace was slow and silent. Villagers gathered along the road, whispering, but this time their eyes were different, less angry, more curious. Elder Thomas walked beside him, leaning on his staff. "Your steps may be heavy, my king, but your spirit walks lighter now." At the palace gate, the guards were stunned. Their once proud ruler returned barefoot, his cloak dusty. His face changed. Without a word, they opened the gates. When he entered the court, Princess Grace ran to him, tears in her eyes. "Father," she cried, kneeling, "you came back." He lifted her gently. "No, my child. I have returned." He turned to his advisors and guards. "The throne of pride has fallen. From this day, let justice live here again." He ordered the gates of the palace opened wide, so the poor and broken could enter. He returned the lands taken from widows and orphans. He released prisoners held for debts they could not pay. The people began to gather, their faces glowing with joy. The same crowd that once cursed his name now sang his praise. "Long live the king who kneels before the truth," they shouted. "Long live the king who listens to the poor." King Edward raised his hand to the sky. "No crown shines brighter than a clean heart," he said. And that evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, he sat not on his golden throne, but among his people. He ate their food, heard their stories, and felt the warmth of a kingdom reborn. In the distance, the widow watched from her hut as the winds shifted softly toward the palace. She smiled and whispered, "Justice has found its way home." For many months, peace reigned in the kingdom. The people sang again. The markets overflowed with laughter. The king walked among his people like a father among children. And the land blossomed like a garden after the rain. But peace is a fragile flower, and pride waits like a weed beneath the soil. One night, as the moon floated over the palace, two men sat in the shadows of the royal hall, Lord Darius, the ambitious royal advisor, and Captain Raymond, commander of the guards. "The king has grown weak," Darius whispered. "He listens to the poor instead of his counsel." "Soon, the people will forget who holds power," Raymond frowned. "But the people love him now. They call him the humble king." "Love fades," Darius said sharply. "We were not made to kneel to peasants. If he continues this way, the kingdom will crumble." They shared a cold glance, the kind that carries poison. The next morning, Darius approached the king with false humility. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing, "some of the nobles fear your kindness is making the throne too soft." The king smiled faintly. "Then let the throne be soft enough to feel the pain of the poor." But Darius's eyes hardened. "Mercy is good, my king, but too much mercy invites rebellion." Those words lingered like smoke in the king's heart. That night, as he lay in bed, he began to doubt himself. "Have I gone too far?" he whispered. "Have I weakened the throne by being kind?" In his dream, he stood again before the field of gold. This time, the widow appeared, holding Samuel's hand. The boy spoke softly, "The throne that listens to whispers will soon forget the cries." The king woke up suddenly, trembling. The next day, he rode into the market to see his people, but something felt different. The smiles were fewer, the whispers louder. Rumors had begun to spread that the king's mercy was foolishness, that he favored the poor over the nobles. Darius's seeds were growing. Princess Grace noticed the worry on her father's face. "Father," she said, "do not let the noise of men silence the voice of your heart. You were chosen to heal, not to rule with fear." But the king sighed deeply. "Grace, the crown weighs heavier than before. When I was wicked, I feared no one. Now that I seek good, even friends doubt me." That night, rain fell over the kingdom. Thunder cracked across the sky, the same way it did when the widow first cursed him. As the storm raged, the king fell to his knees in the throne room. "Lord of heaven," he prayed aloud, "do not let my kindness be mistaken for weakness. Teach me how to rule with truth, not fear." Lightning flashed through the open windows, and in that light, for a brief moment, he thought he saw the widow's shadow, smiling. He rose slowly and whispered, "Let the world doubt me. But I will not return to cruelty. Outside, the storm began to calm. And somewhere in the distance, a woman's soft voice whispered in the wind, "The test of mercy is not in peace, but in temptation." The sun rose slowly over the kingdom, breaking through clouds that had hung for weeks. Birds sang again, but inside the palace, something darker brewed. The royal advisor, Lord Darius, could no longer bear the king's new ways. Mercy had replaced fear, humility had replaced pride, and to men like Darius, kindness was weakness. That morning, he gathered several nobles in secret, men who had lost power when the king turned toward compassion. "If we let this continue," Darius said, pacing before them, "we will soon be ruled by peasants. The king has lost his fire." A murmur spread through the chamber. One noble stood. "And what do you propose?" Darius's eyes gleamed. "We take back the throne for the kingdom's stability." In the market, Samuel, now taller, stronger, and wiser, was helping rebuild a broken well. The villagers respected him deeply. He worked with the same humility his mother had taught him. One afternoon, while carrying water, a royal soldier approached. "Boy," the soldier said, "the king requests your presence." Samuel's heart skipped. He had not seen the king since the day of forgiveness. He followed the guard into the palace. There, in the royal courtyard, the king smiled warmly. "Samuel," he said, "you've become a man." "I only followed my mother's teachings," Samuel replied softly. The king nodded. "And that makes you greater than many kings." Their conversation was interrupted by shouts from the palace gate. Soldiers storming in, blades drawn. The king turned sharply. "What is this?" Darius stepped forward, his robe shimmering with arrogance. "Forgive me, my king," he said with a mocking bow, "but your time has ended. The throne must return to strength." Samuel stepped in front of the king. "You can't do this," Darius sneered. "A peasant boy defending a fallen king? How poetic." The captain of the guards hesitated. He remembered the old days of cruelty. His hands trembled. "Darius, this isn't right," he said. But Darius barked, "Arrest the king." The soldiers moved forward, yet one by one they stopped. The people had begun to gather outside the palace gates. Men, women, and children flooded the courtyard, shouting, "Our king, the king of the people." Darius's face twisted in rage. "Move aside," he shouted, but even the guards stepped back. None dared raise their sword. The king looked around, at the faces of those who once feared him, now ready to defend him. Tears filled his eyes. "No throne built on fear can survive," he said softly. Darius lunged forward in anger, drawing a dagger, but Samuel grabbed his arm, struggling with all his strength. In the scuffle, the dagger slipped, striking Darius instead. He fell to the ground, gasping. "Mercy," he whispered. The king knelt beside him. "Even now, I will not be like the man I once was." He held Darius's hand until his final breath left him. The courtyard fell silent. Only the wind moved. Samuel looked at the king, and the king placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. "You've done what no army could do. You reminded me that forgiveness conquers fear." From that day on, the king's rule became a story, not of power, but of peace. And in every corner of the land, mothers told their children, even the hardest hearts can change if truth finds a way in. The storm had passed. For the first time in many years, sunlight poured freely over the palace, washing away the darkness that had once lived there. The kingdom was at peace, but the king's heart still carried a quiet sorrow. That night, he sat alone on the palace balcony, staring at the horizon, where the village lights flickered like distant stars. Samuel walked in quietly, bowing slightly. "You should rest, my king." The king smiled faintly. "When I was wicked, I slept without peace. Now that I seek peace, I cannot sleep." Samuel sat beside him. "My mother used to say, peace doesn't always mean rest. Sometimes it means facing what we've ignored." The king looked at him thoughtfully. "Your mother's words have become the wisdom of this kingdom." The next morning, he gathered the people in the great courtyard. The air was fresh. The land smelled of rain and new beginnings. "My people," he began, his voice strong yet humble, "I have ruled you with pride, and I have ruled you with mercy. But today, I wish to rule you with truth." He paused as the crowd leaned forward. "Power means nothing if it does not serve the people. From this day forward, no widow shall cry alone. No child shall hunger while the palace feasts." A roar of cheers erupted. The king turned to Samuel. "You will lead the new council, a council of hearts, not crowns." Samuel's eyes widened. "But I am no nobleman, and that is why you are fit to lead," the king said gently. Later that day, Princess Grace found her father sitting under the old fig tree, the same tree where his late queen used to rest. "Father," she said softly, "you've changed this land." He nodded slowly. "But I cannot change the past. I can only build what comes after." Grace knelt beside him, tears in her eyes. "Mother would be proud of you." The king closed his eyes, his face peaceful. And so would the widow. That evening, he rode quietly to the widow's old home. It was now rebuilt, surrounded by green plants and laughter. Children played outside, and Samuel's wife was teaching them songs. The king stepped down from his horse and walked to a small grave marked with a stone. He knelt and placed a white flower upon it. "You gave me back my soul," he whispered. "Your forgiveness saved a kingdom." As the wind brushed through the trees, it carried a faint, familiar whisper, soft and tender, "Lead them with love." The king smiled through his tears. "I will." That night, the stars burned brighter than ever. From the palace walls to the smallest huts, laughter and music filled the air. The kingdom that had once lived in fear now lived in faith. And though the widow was gone, her spirit lingered in every act of kindness, in every heart that chose forgiveness over pride. Years passed. The kingdom that once wept under cruelty now thrived under compassion. The people built new roads, new schools, and new hearts. And though the king's hair had turned silver, his spirit glowed brighter than ever. He ruled not with a scepter, but with love, not from a throne of gold, but from a heart of peace. One morning, the palace bells rang softly, not for war or sorrow, but for remembrance. It was the Day of the Widow, a new tradition the king had created. Every year, the kingdom gathered to honor the poor, the orphans, and the widows, those whose prayers had once saved them all. Children in white cloth carried flowers through the streets. Drums beat slowly, not in mourning, but in gratitude. Samuel, now a respected leader, stood before the people and spoke. Once, this land was filled with fear, but a widow's tear changed a king's heart. "Let no one say that the small are powerless," the crowd responded with thunderous applause. The king, seated under a great canopy, smiled as tears filled his eyes. He turned to Princess Grace, now a wise and noble queen, beside him. "Your generation must remember this," he said softly. "A kingdom is not remembered by its riches, but by how it treats its weakest." Grace nodded, holding his hand. As night fell, the king walked once more to the widow's resting place. The moon hung full and bright, painting the earth with silver light. He knelt before her grave, just as he had done years ago. But this time, there was no sorrow, only peace. "Mother of mercy," he whispered, "your forgiveness became the light of my life. I was blind, but you saw the good I could be. Now, this land walks in that light." A gentle wind rose. The tall grass swayed, and the night air shimmered softly. The faint, loving voice of the widow seemed to whisper through the breeze. "The heart that forgives will never die." The king smiled. He looked to the stars, and for a brief moment he thought he saw her standing there, radiant and calm, her son beside her, both smiling down. He whispered, "Rest well, my teacher." When dawn broke, the people awoke to find the king sitting beneath the fig tree, eyes closed, face peaceful, crown resting in his lap. He had passed quietly in his sleep, but across the land, no one cried in despair. They cried in gratitude, for their king had not died a tyrant. He had died a man reborn. That evening, Samuel stood before the people. "Our king has gone to join the widow in peace," he said. "But his spirit will live wherever kindness rules and pride is broken." He raised his hand toward the rising sun. "Let every home, every child, every heart remember, forgiveness builds what hate destroys." The crowd knelt, their voices blending into one powerful prayer that rose into the sky. From the heavens, the light seemed to glow brighter, as if the widow herself smiled upon her people. And so, the tale of the wicked king and the widow became more than a story. It became a law written in hearts, a song sung through generations. The crown of mercy shines longer than gold. The power of forgiveness lives forever. Dear viewers, what lesson did you take away from this dramatic tale? We'd love to hear from your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the story, give us a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and hit the subscribe button. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest updates. Thanks for watching and stay blessed.